the head when he described the current policy as a scam, a total scam. And when I'm talking, in my talk, I'm not talking just about cannabis, but all illicit drugs. Because most illicit drugs have been perfectly legal previously. It's really a relatively new thing for most illicit drugs to be illicit. And I think it's widely recognised, and it was recognised after the 1930s depression, that prohibition doesn't work against alcohol. It doesn't work against drugs. All it means is when you maintain drugs to be illegal, then it just means some people get fat off the sale of those drugs. Basically, what we've got a situation is that prohibition of illicit drugs mean that drugs have a very high value. It's a very profitable enterprise to get into. It's led to the development of a criminal and a violent criminal industry connected to drugs, simply through maintaining drugs' illegal status. And it's also led to, I'm sure many of you know, in Brisbane, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, everyone knew that if you wanted drugs, you went to the cops because they on-sold the drugs. So and you look at the United States, the law enforcement agency that's responsible for trying to control drugs, you know, many of the members of that agency, including very high up people, are actually really running the drugs trade. So it doesn't work. There's been much evidence that it doesn't work. And then there's the whole issue of drugs and prison, which Michael talked about it before. You know, in Victoria, because of maintaining drugs as being illicit, and the tougher sentencing of the previous government and the current government, it means that our prison population has increased by almost 50% in the last decade. And 50 to 80% of Victorian prisoners have a drug or alcohol dependence problem. If illicit drugs were legalised, then our prisons would empty by at least half, maybe more, overnight. It's very expensive to keep people in prison, and it's very dangerous for those people who are locked up in prison. It has a terrible impact on their lives, both in terms of poverty, in terms of getting into more serious crime, in terms of violence. And then there's another discrimination which I also think we should oppose, which is drug tests for people on the job. And cannabis stays in your system for quite a long time. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of prisoners and also workers who are in jobs where there are frequent drug tests switch to other drugs, which maybe have a more harmful effect, which go through your system much more quickly. It's very dangerous and discriminatory, the whole drug testing policy. But why are the governments maintaining such a failed policy? Because it's been shown time and time again to be a failed policy. Well, I think there are a number of reasons why governments maintain this policy of keeping cannabis and other drugs illegal. One, it's big business. Two, it's well-connected people who are involved. And I remember in the early 1980s when the Liberal Party government introduced the Royal Commission into the Painters and Dockers Federation, mainly to try and smash the union, but suddenly they started to get evidence that Kerry Packer was the Mr. Big of drugs, the goanna. They immediately shut down the inquiry. I think another reason why the governments, both Liberal and Labor, maintain this failed policy is because it maintains a large percentage of the population in prison. And we've got a private prison industry which makes makes profits out of having a lot of people in prison. And I think another reason is that it justifies a large police force. A large police force that the government would like to keep in reserve in order to prevent people from taking action in defence of their own rights. So you need something to justify having a large police force whose main reason for existence is its ability to repress protests and repress workers taking strike action. But and sometimes the narcotics laws are used in a political way. Coming from Queensland in the early 1980s, when there was a big Aboriginal rights protest over the Commonwealth Games in 1982, a lot of people who the police got the details of at that protest were all raided under the Narcotics Act after the Commonwealth Games, because the narcotics laws are used in a political way. Socialist Alliance's policy is supporting the legalisation of all illicit drugs, in particular cannabis, because any kind of issues that people might have with drugs or drug addiction, it's a health issue, it's not a law and order issue. If people have a health issue as a result of taking some form of drug, then they need all the health services that should be available in such a rich country like Australia. And one of the things which shows the total double standards of our governments, including the old Howard government, is that at the same time as they carried out their war on drugs, they funded very few drug detox centres around the country. A lot of the centres were run by religious organisations, and there were very few detox centres. So it shows that the whole war on drugs is a total sham. It's a total sham. If they were genuine, there would be health services available for people who need them to deal with drug issues. So we think the whole scam should be abolished and illicit drugs, especially cannabis, should be legalised.